Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming in today for our fifth PGSSC Global Surgery Research Seminar. Today we have two amazing speakers who will be sharing their experience on neurosurgery during COVID-19 pandemic, surveys for trainees and also providers. For those who first time joining us today, PGSSC Global Surgery Research Seminar is a 10-session series to explore methods and outcome of global surgery research. Every month, the first Thursday of the month, we will have two speakers that we speak on similar topics or methods, followed by an open discussion on implication of the results and methods. The video will be posted immediately after this seminar. This is actually preceded by complimentary journal club by the fellows and also the research assistant in PGSSC. So before I go in to introduce our two amazing speakers, I'd like to first pass my thanks and appreciation for the coordinating team for today's PGSSC Global Surgery Research Seminar, the faculty and also the fellows and RAs that tirelessly helping in coordinating this seminar. And just to remind everyone that we have the next seminar on the 10th of February on safety in surgery, the use of checklists. All right, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Ronnie Batikulon, who will be talking on his paper titled Impact of COVID-19 on Neurosurgical Training in Southeast Asia. Dr. Ronnie Batikulon is a consultant pediatric neurosurgeon at Philippine General Hospital and a professor in anatomy at University of Philippines College of Medicine in Manila, Philippines. He completed his pediatric neurosurgery fellowship at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Australia, and also trained in endoscopic treatment of hydrocephalus at Cure Children's Hospital in Mbale, Uganda. He is currently the member of WFNS Young Neurosurgeon Forum. Before, I would like to invite Dr. Ronnie Batikulon to start his presentation. Thank you. For those who just joined us today, can have a look at the chat and tell us where you're joining from today. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'm Ronnie Batikulon from Philippine General Hospital in Manila, Philippines.
Hi, I'm Tasri Ukinakon from Queen Surrogate National Institute of Shai Health, Bangkok, Thailand.
Dr. Vincent Nadiong Peng from the National University Hospital of Singapore.
Dr. Mina Sobana from University of Pajajaran, Hasan Sadikin Hospital in Bandung, West Java, Indonesia.
Hello, hi. My name is Faisal from University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
And we're here to present our study on the impact of COVID-19 on neurosurgical training in Southeast Asia. Our paper has been published in World Neurosurgery and may be accessed by scanning the QR code you see on your screen.
Neurosurgery department worldwide restricted the training program because of the COVID pandemic. Here we describe the changes in the neurosurgical training in Southeast Asia during the first wave of the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020. In May 2020, we conducted an online survey among neurosurgery residents in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand using Google Forms. The 33 items questionnaires collected data on elective and emergency neurosurgical operations, ongoing learning activities, and health worker safety.
A total of 298 of 470 neurosurgery residents completed the survey. This is equivalent to 63% response rate. Trainees from all countries reported a decrease in elective and emergency neurosurgical operations. But for the emergencies, Indonesia and Malaysia had a significantly greater reduction in their caseloads compared to Singapore and Thailand. For elective surgeries, the decrease in operations in Indonesia and in the Philippines were significantly greater compared to other countries.
A higher percentage of neurosurgery residents from Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore continue to perform surgeries for brain tumors, spinal cord tumors, and degenerative diseases of the spine. It must be emphasized that these three countries had lower numbers of COVID-19 cases and death at the time of the study.
Based on our survey, we found that most of our neurosurgical trainees in the Southeast Asia countries have several concerns with their practice. Number one, they are worried about board certification exam and whether COVID-19 will delay their graduation. And they are worried about the postponement of the cases and whether this will affect their training during this period, whether they have enough cases. And number three, they are concerned with the cases after the COVID-19, whether there will be an overload of cases. They also concerned with the COVID-19 and the pandemic itself, whether they will get infected with COVID-19 during their time in the hospital, and whether they will bring COVID-19 infection to their immediate families when they go home.
In conclusion, an effective national strategy to control COVID-19 infections and deaths is crucial to be able to sustain neurosurgical training and provide essential neurosurgical services. Neurosurgical training programs are encouraged to develop online learning modules and set up simulation laboratories to enable trainees to systematically acquire knowledge and develop practical skills during these challenging times and beyond. Thank you.
Great. So good day, everyone. I am Ronnie Baticulan. Let me just share my screen. So you've met my co-authors and good friends. Thank you once again to the Harvard Program in Global Surgery and Social Change for inviting me to speak today. Good morning, good day, good night, good evening to everyone. I'm Ronnie Baticulan, professor and pediatric neurosurgeon from University of the Philippines, Manila and Philippine General Hospital in Manila, Philippines. You can find me on Twitter at Ronnie Bats. So today I'll be talking about how we did our study last year in 2020. So in 2020, this was the early phase of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. I have no disclosures. I would like to acknowledge, of course, the trainees from the 5 different Southeast Asian countries who participated in the survey, without whom this study would not have been possible. So I would like to begin with this photo. So as you can see, so actually among all the 5 authors, so the 4 other co-authors, the only one I haven't met in person is Vincent from Singapore, but we were all good friends. So the nice thing about this study is that it just so happened we're all pediatric neurosurgeons, so we know each other. Kung, or Dr. Nathasiri Wintayano Corn, is my co-fellow. That's a top photo. She was my co-fellow in Melbourne. So we've known each other for a bit of time. And then Faisal and Mirna from Malaysia and Indonesia, we see each other often in pediatric neurosurgery meetings. And then Kung knows Vincent, so Kung connected me to Vincent, and that's how we ended up doing this study. So I suppose that's really the nice thing about this work. You can just imagine when we were doing the study, it was the early phase of the pandemic, when the whole world shut down and we didn't know what would happen. We didn't have vaccines. We didn't have any effective treatment. We didn't know how things are gonna go, and yet we chose to do research. And we chose to. So those were really challenging times. Those were really challenging times. But we thought that because it was something that has not happened before. Can you just imagine? We were all sharing our experiences then, and all of our trainees were having difficulties, and we thought that we needed to document that. We thought we need to document that, not just to document that, but because we thought that we need to be able to, if we're not going to be able to identify where the gaps are, it would be difficult to plan how to make interventions so that these gaps are resolved, not just for that time, but but even afterward, even after the pandemic has lapsed. So I wanted to give everyone a sense of how we did it. So this is the timeline of how things went. So we had our first Zoom meeting last week of April, and I went back to my emails and I sent the first version of the protocol on May 2 to the four of them. So and then we had a WhatsApp group. We had a WhatsApp group, and then as I've told you, we're all friends. So it's really just hey, why don't we do this? I asked Kung, what do you think about doing this? And the nice thing is that all of us are fairly relatively young junior consultants, and we are in touch with our trainees from our countries. Uh, and then we developed the protocol. We applied for ethical approval. So Dr. Kung from Thailand sought ethical approval for the study in her institute. And then once we got, and then that was also the time when we met, I think twice or thrice. We would exchange emails. So I drafted the survey instrument, and then they critically revised it. And then we finally started the survey on May 22. So this was only after ethical approval. The survey period took about 10 days, and then we started preparing the manuscript. So the manuscript preparation took about 3 weeks. So from May 31 to June 24. So that's about 3.5 weeks before we were finally able to submit it to World Neurosurgery. At that time, I think there were 2 or 3 other manuscripts already published about the experiences of other trainees elsewhere in the world. So we submitted on June 24, and then 2 weeks later, it got rejected. So during the first round of peer reviews, it was actually rejected. The manuscript was actually rejected. And I was actually wondering why. I think we got 5 peer reviews. Only 1 was negative, but the manuscript was rejected. Of course, we believe that this was important work, so we didn't give up. So 10 days later, we resubmitted. So 10 days later, we resubmitted, and this time, it was approved. It was accepted without any additional round of peer review. What I did was I really revised the cover letter. So I revised. When we reviewed the manuscript, we made the changes suggested by the peer reviewers. And then I put in the cover letter that we really believe this was important work. And the thing about our paper was that I highlighted in the cover letter how our manuscript was different from the other studies already published elsewhere. So I think the North American study and the UK study had already been published by that time. But we highlighted in our paper that because our countries, the 5 countries included in the study, had different controls, had different incidences, different numbers of COVID-19 cases and deaths. And we've shown in our study that if you get good control of COVID-19, then you're able to sustain neurosurgical operations, and trainees get to do more. So I made sure to highlight that in the cover letter, and I think that made a difference. And then it was available online a week later, and so I'm here now. So as you can see, so that took about 16 weeks. So that took about 16 weeks in all. If you're listening, if you haven't if you're keen on publishing, or if you haven't published anything yet, this just gives you a sort of timeline on how things work. And my the moral for everyone is don't give up. Don't give up. So let me just cover a few things. Number 1, ethical review. So there are some researchers who feel that survey studies don't need ethical approval. My personal take on this is that even if it's just a survey study, remember, there are 2 issues you need to consider. It matters if it's a confidential or anonymous survey. And there has to be consent still. There has to be consent still. Remember, even though we're not talking about patients, when the participants answer your survey, they are providing personal information. And whenever you deal with personal information, of course, that makes it must be handled carefully. You must, for example, as a researcher, you're obligated to follow data privacy rules. You're obligated. I mean, you're duty bound. You're bound to keep that information safe. And you know the thing is, the exemption rules vary with each country. So for example, here, this is our ethics board. This is the exemption form for our ethics board in the University of the Philippines. Surveys are usually exemptable. So you can see here, they're not automatically exempt, but they're exemptable. Why? Because sometimes, for example, you might be asking personal information, you might be asking for information that might compromise your respondents. So my rule of thumb here is that just try to get ethical approval. Even if it's just a survey study, if the ethics reviewer just says, okay, that's exempt, then that's good enough. I think that's the best way to do it, rather than to assume that your study, your survey study is exempt. Okay? And then most journals now require justification why you didn't seek ethical approval. So you wouldn't want to find out during the submission process that your paper could not be published because you didn't get the proper ethical review. And remember, any data that you obtain before proper ethical approval is invalid. So if you obtain data before ethical approval, the most journals will consider that data invalid. Now, how do you design surveys? So these are some important questions I've learned that you need to address. So number one, how do you ensure that your survey instrument is valid? So we don't just create questionnaires. Validity is very important. What do you mean by validity? Is your survey instrument, do your questions, does it measure what you intend to measure? So that's what I mean when you say validity. That's the simplest explanation. Does your survey instrument capture the data, or is it meant to, does it measure what you want to measure? So you go back to your objectives. What do you want to get out of this study? All right, so validity, so if your survey is valid, then it means that it's suited for its purpose. Now there are different ways to do. There's different ways to ensure validity. The simplest, and what we've done here, is just face validity, meaning to say you get a field, you talk to us to field experts to review your questionnaire, and just to make sure that your questionnaire suits your study purpose. I will be pointing to references later that you could read up on. Next, when you do global studies like this, you need to ask, would you need to translate your survey questions into several languages? Okay, so for us, so for example, for our study, the good thing about the study, again, is that all the authors come from different backgrounds. And so, for example, before we deploy the survey, we asked Kung from Thailand to try to see whether the most of the trainees in her country would be able to comprehend English. How because sometimes, for example, if we are so used to speaking English, sometimes forget that something that might appear easily understood to us is actually not easily understood to others. So it's always very important to have the language reviewed. And for example, and then we asked Vincent, do you think we need to translate to Mandarin or to Chinese? And he said, no, most trainees would, because he knows the Chinese well. He said, no, that's okay. So I think that you'd be surprised. Sometimes the only thing that discourages people from answering your survey is the language. How do you maximize recruitment and minimize dropout? So this is where design, and this is where the length of your questionnaire are really important. So I'll go to this in detail later. And then how do you mitigate bias? So the most important, so remember this is something you think about while you're designing your survey. This is not something you think about when you're already writing up the discussion. So this is something you think about when you're still drafting the survey instrument. So for example here, so how do we mitigate bias? So what biases do you usually need to mitigate? Number one, selection bias. So here our problem was, this was a pandemic trying to figure out what are the needs of those who are affected by the pandemic. But you see the problem here, if you're severely affected by the pandemic, you would not be able to answer the survey. You would not have time to answer an online survey, right? And then for example, if you want to explore the reasons why people don't do online learning, it's probably best not to do it through an online survey, because they would not be there. Right? They would not be there. The people who do not want to engage in online learning will not be there. Then the other thing is, we want, specifically for our survey, we wanted to ensure that our trainees would not be hesitant to discuss their training conditions. So we specifically stated that when they answer the survey, their training programs would not be disclosed. So we will not be analyzing, we would not be analyzing the data based on stratified by training program, because otherwise people might be hesitant to answer because they might be afraid, for example, of repercussions if they say that they're not getting enough benefits in where they work. Survey design. So this is how you need to make sure that your survey instrument, especially now since we do online surveys now, work well on mobile. So this is how on the left, that's how it looks on the computer. This is how it looks on the mobile. We use Google Forms for this, but there are other survey platforms you can use. SurveyMonkey, Redcap's actually nice, but Google Forms is, I think, the easiest. Google Forms, I think, is the easiest. So you see, make sure it's mobile phone compatible, so that, for example, if you're serving trainees, they could just do it. And then this is very important, this introductory paragraph that tells respondents right away what is the survey about, how long will it take, what information is needed from them, and put in contact information. Don't forget to put in contact information, that if they have questions, if you're hesitant to answer, please put in contact information. So you see here we did require email addresses. This is just to make sure that we don't get duplicates. Of course, it's up to you if your survey is confidential or anonymous. Anonymous surveys are more difficult to clean up. It will be more difficult for you to identify which are duplicate entries or not. That's a difficulty with anonymous surveys. So how do you do that? What if you do an anonymous survey? How do you ensure that there are no duplicates? So what we usually do is that there are usually two people who analyze the data, the raw data, independently, and they would flag which entries they think are duplicates. And then if they agree, then that's it. But if they disagree, then there has to be another arbiter. All right, surveys is another thing on survey design. These questions are very important. So you see here, at the start of the survey, we asked. So even though in the introduction we already state that this is for neurosurgery residents, okay? So but still, you still need to ask this question: are you a neurosurgery resident in training? So isn't this redundant? Why would you still need to put this? Or for example, why would you still and then here in the countries that we asked, so which countries are you from? Which country are you from? But you see here, there's an other field. And you might be wondering, why put in an other field when you specifically said that you'll analyze data only from 5 countries? Because this is online. People answer surveys sometimes not really thinking about these things. And so this is the main purpose of these questions, is to catch all people who might mistakenly answer your survey. So this will save you a lot of trouble. So my suggestion, if you're doing a survey, make sure that your first few questions consider your inclusion criteria. Okay. So make sure that the first 2 or 3 questions, that way when you're analyzing the data, it will be easy for you to weed out all the responses that should not have been included in the first place. So that is the purpose of putting in these questions. So for example, in our study, there was some respondent from another Southeast Asian country. Might have been misled because it says here Southeast Asia, but at least we were able to remove that entry right away. And then finally here, informed consent. This is where you can put in a branch point in your Google form. So if the respondent does not consent, then automatically the survey closes. And again, this is very important for ethical approval. So actually most people, those who do research will tell you, answering a survey is implicit consent. So meaning to say, when you put in your responses, that's already implied consent. But it's always best if you have something like this at the start of your survey, then it explicitly says that your respondents agree to providing their personal information, and you just have to make sure as researchers that you handle them with care. Questions. So you see here, you could put in required questions. So just make sure that you put the asterisk there means that the question is required. You need to be able to identify which questions are very important for you. Again, when you're designing your survey instrument, before, you should already have the final tables in mind. Okay, That's the other thing. When you design your survey instrument, you should already be writing your results in mind. Okay, so it must be very clear to you which data points you will need and will be absolutely necessary for you to be able to write your paper. Now, other common pitfalls. So, for example, here on the left side, you see here this is tick boxes. So you put in tick boxes. You see here the if none, please leave the boxes blank. One of the most common mistakes is you have tick boxes where the respondents can tick any one or two or three or any box at all, and then they put in none of the above. What's the problem with that? So if a respondent accidentally ticks none of the above and then ticks on the other boxes as well, then that response is already invalid. So that's just it. I think it's a shame because that's a data point that you lose. So remember, every data point is important. So you need to be very careful with this. So I will go, and then the important thing here, you need to put in here, the progress bar is very important. The progress bar is very important because it will give your respondents an idea how long they will spend answering your survey. Again, that one of the most irritating things about answering a survey is not knowing how long is this gonna go, how much more time do I need to answer this. And remember, if you're surveying trainees, they have very little time. Survey implementation. So after we developed our survey instrument, so how did we promote it? So we posted it on Facebook. We neurosurgery cocktail. I posted it on Twitter. It was shared. The important thing here, get a short URL, a shortened URL. So you need to be able to promote your study readily. So how do you do that? Use a shortened URL. So bit.ly, tiny URL. And then you can also get a QR code. So you can easily generate the QR code now. But I think the most important thing here is you know your target respondents. For us, actually, for the trainees, because I've said, because all 5 of us are involved with the trainees in our respective countries, it was quite easy because most of our trainees have WhatsApp or Viber groups, and we just forwarded the invitation there. And then pilot testing is very important. So always do a pilot test before you deploy your survey. Again, when you say pilot testing, you administer the survey first to a test to sample a sample of respondents among your target respondents. They would usually recommend between 12 to 20 respondents. So most studies would say around 12 to 20 respondents would suffice for a pilot test. And the purpose of a pilot test is for you to be able to identify whether some questions are not easily understood, whether some responses would need a free text response, or there's a missing option. So it's really, really helpful to put in a pilot test. So this is a very good paper on how to develop questionnaires. This is a medical education paper. So I teach at the National University, so I'm also involved in medical education research. But this one, if you haven't done any survey studies before, this is a very good summary of how to develop questionnaires. So you can see here, number 1, you conduct a literature review first. Number 2, you do a focus group discussion or conduct interviews among the possible respondents. Synthesize his findings, develop the items. So you see, developing the items, thinking of the questions is actually number 4. The most common mistake, I think, is to do this first, to develop the questions first. Remember, it doesn't come until much later. You need to know what data you know first. And then validity. This is where validity comes in. Number 6, cognitive interviews. This is when in most research studies, this is the part that's often omitted. But if you read on the paper, this is interviewing respondents and trying to see whether they understood the questions and the way you wanted them to comprehend it. And then finally, number 7, pilot testing. So you see, the paper highlights the most common mistakes when creating survey questions. So for example, double barrel items, or using statements instead of questions, or creating double negatives, putting in double negatives. So I find this paper really, really helpful. So if you intend on doing any survey studies, so for example, one of you see here, they recommend against using this: strongly disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree, instead of actual statements. So that's really helpful. And then this other one's also nice. So Likert scales. So you know the scales like this where you have the 5 points. So there's actually a proper way to do these Likert scales. So this is a good paper. You know, And this would come later when you analyze Likert scales. So you see, I'm sure you've seen papers where they converted Likert scales into numeric values, and then they computed for the mean and standard deviation. That's actually not correct because Likert scales, they're not interval on an interval scale. It's an ordinal scale, meaning to say one value is higher than the other, but they're not equally spaced. So you should not treat them like ordinal. You cannot compute for the mean. You should use median and non-parametric tests. Uh, I would like to highlight that after you've done your research, it's very important to disseminate your work. So you see key part here, I was asked, so I actually reported the data from our survey before we got it published. I presented it first in the first global neurosurgery webinar. So it was a good way for us to be able to disseminate our study findings even before publication. So you see, when you do research like this, what you really want to do is to be able to help, right? To be able to because this was a pandemic and we needed to map out interventions. And we wouldn't be waiting for a publication for that. We wanted to disseminate the data right away as much as possible. So that will be able to be helpful already to the beneficiaries of this study, to the intended beneficiaries of this study. You can do dissemination through preprint servers now. So that's one thing you can do. So if you don't, if you feel that your data is robust and would withstand and reliable enough, and it's really important, you can use preprint servers. And then once it's published, very important to write about your work. So I hope you're all familiar with this study in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery, where they compared articles that were tweeted randomly from those that were not tweeted. And they found out that after a year, those articles that were tweeted had much higher citations and altmetric scores. So that's what we did. So after our paper was published, I tweeted about it. So you could see, just to give you an idea what sort of engagement you get. So for example, when I posted this tweet summarizing our study findings, this was seen 13,000 times. So this tweet was seen 13,000 times. And to be honest, if you ask journals, these numbers are hard to come by. So since then, we've had in Google Scholar, we've had 23 citations, 22 in dimensions. But these citations, this is not really the more important thing at the end of the day. Was your study actually useful? Did you actually achieve your goals? So, for example, from our end, in the Philippines, I can say that our study findings have been useful to the training programs. So the different training programs have been able to adjust their learning outcomes for the trainees, made sure to make, for example, when it was clear that the trainees were not getting enough cases. So training programs were able to make adjustments. So for example, they would ask their trainees to scrub in as well in the other hospitals. They made sure, for example, that there are dedicated hospitals where they would still be able to do neurosurgical operations. And you know why? Because they already have the evidence. The evidence was already there that the trainees need help. And I think that's the most important thing. Now, I would like to end with this. So some important things to note when you're doing global health, global neurosurgery research. There's a move to decolonize global health. I would hope that there's also a move to decolonize global neurosurgery. And these are two pieces recently published in Lancet Global Health that I highly encourage you to read, especially our Global North colleagues, our Global North collaborators. So first, what is wrong with global health? So again, I think I'd like everyone to reflect on all the global health projects you've worked on, all the global papers you've published or working on. So you see, whenever we do global surgery research, inevitably there will be power asymmetry, and there will be power imbalance, and it's up to us to make sure that when we do these projects, we level out those things. So for example, in most papers, when you look at papers and global health papers, who's actually first author, who's actually last author, who are the middle authors. So for example, I still see papers on global health and global surgery where talking about conditions in low and middle income countries. But when you look at the authors list, they're mostly from high income countries. This should not be happening. And while we're moving forward with the global neurosurgery movement, I encourage you, I implore everyone to be conscious about this. My opinion is that people don't do this. My opinion is that people don't do these things intentionally, but you need to be aware. We know that you have good intentions, but you need to be aware of these things. So, for example, this one is, I think this is really good article on epistemic injustice, where it talks about credibility deficit, credibility excess, interpretive marginalization. Where you see it depends on, for example, when you write the paper, when you do global research, right? Who's doing the interpretation of data? How do the global South partners feel? So what are the things? What are the challenges? For example, I would like to ask you, when you do global health or global surgery research, who assigns roles and decides on authorship? It's as simple as, what time do you hold your meetings? Do you actually rotate the time zone so that the LMIC authors are not always up in the middle of the night? And and then who gets to speak during meetings? It's not enough. For example, when you do research like this, so for example, here you have 5 different authors working on a paper from 5 different countries. Who gets to speak? Who gets to dominate the conversation? And if you must understand, not everyone is straightforward enough to be able to volunteer his or her opinion. You know what would help? So for example, if you're from a high-income country or from the global north, actively seek out the opinion of your global South colleagues. Ask them, what do you think about this? And sometimes sometimes we're afraid to speak out because we're afraid that if we say something or if we contradict our global North colleagues, they might no longer want to work with us. So that really happens. That thinking really happens, and you have to understand, you have to make it easier for your LMIC colleagues to speak out, voice out their opinion. If somebody, for example, if an HIC colleague is dominating the conversation, try to actively seek out the voice of your LMIC colleagues. Who analyzes and interprets the data? So for example, when you do research with your LMIC colleagues, do you just give them the discussion? Okay, here's what we wrote. What do you think about it? When in fact, what you should have done is you should have met together and say, how do we interpret the data that we collected? Again, these are just challenges to everyone, and it would really be helpful for all of us. We go back to the reason, why do you want to do this global health research? And it all goes back to that. It's not because we want to get the Google Scholar citations, or we want to get our H index or I-10 index up. It's because we really want to make essential neurosurgical care available to everyone who needs it. So yeah, I'm borrowing a phrase from Dr. Rhea Liang, a general surgeon in Australia. She has the phrase called "operate with respect." So it's collaborate with respect. So I challenge everyone to collaborate with respect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watikulan, for your insightful talk and presentation. I would like to invite our second speaker today, Dr. Beverly Chester, who will be talking on her paper titled Continental Survey on Impact of COVID-19 on Neurosurgical Training in Africa. Dr. Chester has a subspecialty interest in skull-based surgery and pituitary, both in microsurgical and endoscopic techniques. Her other interests include global health, teaching, and clinical research. Prior to joining Aga Khan University Hospital in Kenya, Dr. Chestram was a Weill Cornell Global Health Fellow based in Muhimbili Orthopedic Institute in Tanzania. She has also been a skull-based fellow at University Hospital Wales and a consultant neurosurgeon in Brighton and Sussex University Hospital in the UK. I would like to invite Dr. Chestram to start with her presentation. Let me unshare my slides. Meanwhile, please do check in the chat. Can click and show us where you're joining our talk today. Thank you.
So can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. And I just checked the audience out. It's just really fantastic to be here. And also very fantastic to be following on after Ronnie, who has given an outstanding presentation. So mine comes more on a reflective perspective about what we've done and where we're at now. And when we come to the methodology, what I would really appreciate is just an open discussion, whether now that we know what we know, how would we do things differently in gathering information? So the reason I got this invitation is I was involved in the write-up of 2 papers. One was a continent, and both of them were under the same survey. So one was the impact of COVID-19 on the neurosurgical services in Africa. And the other subset, of course, was on specifically on neurosurgical training in Africa. And how did we get here? I was just looking at my phone. On April the 5th, I was on Twitter. So Prof. Park will be happy to know that I'm on Twitter. And I saw this call out from the JNS, which is based in America, asking for articles to share about the experiences of COVID-19 in the region that people were practicing. And my question was, who is writing for Africa and the experience of Africans? So I contacted Professor Qureshi and Ignatius Asene, many of whom will recognize them and say, what are we going to do? And the 2 of them mobilized a team of people so that we could do this project. And that was very important because of the need to be in a position to tell the stories of your own experience in your own real time and to preserve that for posterity, just as Ronnie has explained. So Africa is a continent of many odds. For example, it is the oldest continent, with the cradle of mankind being assumed from Africa. But it is also the youngest continent, with the average age being only 18, and about 1.4 billion people in 54 countries. But it does have a paucity of neurosurgeons. Our latest estimate put it at about 2,500, and most of them being concentrated in the African Northern Hemisphere and in Southern Africa. Many narratives, many of the publications that come from the continent are not written in the first person. In other words, the principal authors, both in scientific literature and also in other forms of literature, are not principally through the African voices. And there is currently no neurosurgical PubMed index journal on the continent. So most of this content, if it's in the local journals, doesn't necessarily get the same dissemination opportunities. And therefore, it almost seems like there's a vacuum in information coming from the local clinicians. So how did we do this? Now, just to put it into context, although I have been introduced as currently working at the Aga Khan, at that time, I was a fellow based in Dar es Salaam for the Will Cornell project when we started this work. And the world was shutting down. There was more and more travel restrictions, and many of the places were shutting down their clinical practice. So we wanted to sample what people were experiencing. So we developed a Google questionnaire, which was in English, and we sampled this amongst a couple of our colleagues to ensure that there was ease of completion, that the questions made sense. And in particular, we wanted to understand a little bit about the demographics of the individuals who were responding. We wanted to understand their experiences with COVID in terms of their ability to have a national response, access to PPE, where they're getting their information from. So that was the wider context of the study. But in particular for trainees, we wanted to know how COVID had affected their training. So overall, there's a 54-point questionnaire, and as I said, and this was discussed at the CANS Council meeting. So CANS is a Continental Association of African Neurosurgical Societies, and it's one of our continental bodies. We have other continental bodies, such as PANS, which is the Pan-African Association of Neurosurgical Societies, and each of the different regions, East, North, West, South, also have their own representative bodies, not to mention national bodies, and in some countries, more than one national body. We then, having got permission from the CANS Council, we distributed it through the social media platforms as detailed above, and we undertook the survey for over a month. And the reason why we chose a month is that we wanted there to be some correlation between the experiences of those who were responding. We thought that if it was open-ended, then the evolution of the pandemic would also affect our ability to understand the information. And then we performed simple descriptive analysis. So we set out just to describe what people were experiencing rather than statistically important differences. And then all authors repeatedly reviewed the results and were also involved in the write-up. So I'm just going to go through the results, and then I'm just going to look at how just to deconstruct it. And that's because Ronnie, I think, has done a brilliant job in looking at the pros and cons of how you set up your study. So these are the countries that responded with their trainees. There were 23 in all, and we had 123 respondents. And you can see there are spikes in several countries. And many of those countries also had authors on the paper. So Kenya, where I come from, Nigeria, which is represented by Mohamed Raji, South Africa, which is represented by Graham Fegan, and Zimbabwe by Kalango. But you can see that in many countries, we only got 1 or 2 responses, so that we didn't have as many responses as we would have liked. But one of the first problems is there really didn't exist any information about what our denominator was going to be. So if you remember what Ronnie had been sharing, he could tell you exactly how many trainees are within their system. And maybe we can discuss about how we could strengthen that so that we know that the data is much more robust. And then in terms of the durations of training, so as a continent of the 54 countries, about 24 of them have neurosurgical training schemes, but they're not all the same in their duration. So we only asked people whether they were in the early, middle, or senior stages. And that's because neurosurgical training takes anywhere from 3 to 6 years, depending on the country you're in. And most would qualify themselves as senior trainees, and therefore we thought there would be reasonable agreeability in terms of the effect on their clinical services. The orange represents a reduction in services. So there's a reduction in clinics, in elective surgery, as well as in emergency surgery. And we can discuss later on why that is. And the same is true for, actually, let me just put it out there at the moment. One of the things that happened in many African countries is an immediate lockdown, and most African countries experience trauma from economic activities like mining, farming, riding border. So if you shut down the country and you have forced quarantine, then you have a reduction in trauma and in its associated complications. And then in the median clinical activities, you could also see even in the total numbers. So clinics, there's a marked reduction in people being able to access the clinic services. And this is in many ways is because patients were afraid to come to hospital and there were travel restrictions in place. The trainees were more than 67%. I should have said actually at the beginning, most of the trainees were male. So 91% of the trainees who responded were male, and most lived in urban areas, which echoes many of your own experiences where training is available in more urban settings. Most of the people who reported at that time had not been exposed to COVID. And we'll look back at the timeline of COVID relative to, the timeline of exposure relative to the timeline of the spread of COVID through Africa. And maybe, I think this is a factor. But for those who were exposed to it, the emergency department was the most common. And this, of course, is where you'd find many trainees clocking in patients. And interestingly, not in clinic or in theater, where our core activities also are. And then the other thing that we also looked at is, so we've looked at where they're coming from, where we've looked at what's happened to their clinical practice. We've looked at their concerns about COVID exposure. We've also looked at how they were getting through their training. And this had never been done before, asking people how much you earn while you're in training. And most people had no income. So 1 in 4 were not training with anything, and another 31%, so almost 1 in 3, had less than $1,000 a month. And this concerned us because we're wondering, how are they funding themselves? I think a lot of them were funding through locums, but if there's a reduction in overall clinical activities, that will have an effect on their ability to sustain themselves through the program. And others were depending on families, but most Africans depend on informal employment and agriculture, with most countries experiencing an economic contraction through 2020 and 2021. So therefore, in the long term, are we at risk of losing trainees with the prolonged effects of COVID just because financially they can't sustain completing their program? So just going to the discussion. So this was the first continental survey on the effects of COVID on African trainees. And for that reason, we didn't really know what we would find. And we found a lot in terms of what we just discussed, but there were questions to be asked about even just the model that we used. We used an online survey, and I'm not sure if this is necessarily the best model. One, there's internet costs, which are particularly high on our continent related to other spaces, and also access. In several of the countries that we're surveying, during elections, there was a shutting down of the access to social media. And this may have altered the kind of responses we get. In other countries, there's fear of surveillance. So even if you're asking anonymized questions that they've consented to, and they know it's going to a national body, the nature of some of the information we're asking may have been sensitive enough to put off some of the trainees from answering, completing our survey. We also didn't understand why we had a low turnout from countries that have a large trainee cohort, for example, in Egypt, and many of the countries where we only got single responses. So the first thing we have to ask is, did we really use the right approach in every sense of the word? Going online, using a survey, just contacting people we know. Perhaps this plays to the fact that maybe our contacts and our networks were not as widely spread across the continent as we may have liked. And how do we contextualize the results when we don't have principal data? So in Ronnie's case, he was able to tell you exactly how many trainees there are, what countries they're in. He checked out their language and the primary language of instruction. So if you don't have all that data, how do you know that your data speaks for itself and is truly representative? And also we don't even know the length of training with expected competencies. So we don't know if this reflects a significant change from what would be expected from them. And does a spot survey give a true result of long-term effective training? Disruption in a month, 2 months, I don't know. But now that the pandemic has been with us for 2 years and counting, maybe there's a need for us to look at other ways of analyzing this data. And what was the best vehicle to do this survey? So we used CANS, but there were other regional organizations, and maybe a consideration of a multi-organizational approach would have been much more representative and much more insightful. We also experienced quite the publication challenge. I was very encouraged when Ronnie said he had challenges in publishing, because we approached no less than 3 journals. And one of the feedbacks we kept getting is that the narrative was not particularly new or interesting to the journal. And that's because there were other articles that had been written, but they were written from what we'd call a foreign gaze, where, for example, I live in Kenya, but I write an article about Bermuda. But the article gets accepted, and the next time somebody tries to publish about Bermuda, they say, well, we already have an article on Bermuda. And this just goes to the unequal intellectual space that we currently have, where with the absence of a central body that speaks for all African trainees, in the absence of a PubMed index journal, the conversations about African trainees are not necessarily being propagated by Africans themselves. And in terms of when we talk about the survey, so if you look at this chart, which I posted today, the number of cases in Africa has risen. And if you look to the left of the curve, the time when we were sampling, there was hardly, statistically speaking, the cases were not that many in Africa compared to many other areas. And although there was significant reduction then in access to clinical, clinical exposure, concerns about being exposed to COVID, I wonder whether if we surveyed it today, whether we'd get a totally different response. Now that we've had an increase in COVID cases, now that we've had some improvement of supply chain for surgical material. So at the beginning of, one of the reasons why many African countries shut down the country is that there was a limited number of equipment medically they could use. And so they wanted to reduce trauma cases so that if we had COVID cases, we had the masks and the PPEs and the gloves and the fluids and oxygen, etc. But now that there's improved supply chains, maybe the effect on surgical training has improved. And did COVID affect the transition in training? So we found people in 2020. If we now interview them in 2022, how many are still around? How many have transitioned to other careers? How many are behind on their competencies that they need to acquire? Or how many have adapted and are able to carry on with their training okay? And also, we don't know if concessions were made. So in countries, for example, like the UK, they had special revalidation tools to use during COVID to allow for other skills that the trainees did acquire because they worked in other areas of the hospital. And vaccine access is a challenge in Africa, and I wonder whether this will have a long-term effect on training, either by trainees getting infections or multiple waves in the locale that require shutdown of elective work. So in terms of what could we have done better? There's more than 2,000 languages spoken in Africa by the 1.4 billion people. So should we have done a multilingual questionnaire? And if we've done that, the official languages of most African countries comprise of English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. I put Arabic and Swahili in asterisks because Swahili is the most common African language spoken by 100 million Africans. And I wonder whether when you change the language that you use to survey people, whether you get a very different cultural context to their responses. So that's something for us to think about for the future. We need to have a better understanding, as I described, of the denominator, just to know where the trainees and what they're doing. And I think that perhaps in the future, we need to look into qualitative studies. So these were just really descriptive studies, but if we've done key informant interviews, if we've done focus groups, perhaps we'd have got more information and reached a saturation point with perhaps a smaller number of trainees. And a repeat study to see the evolution of the training experiences, as I explained. So you're looking for trends to know whether that was a one-off or whether it's you can capture what is happening on the continent. But I do worry about survey fatigue. Even as we're surveying the African trainees, they were receiving a lot of surveys. As many of us sat at home and turned to research, perhaps we put out a lot of questions out to people, and the number of surveys being distributed has resulted in a poorer yield than would otherwise have been received. So there are some positives that came out of this. When we asked where the residents, subsequently, there's a paper which was spearheaded by Dada, and Ulrich, who will be familiar to many of the Harvard group, looking at exactly where training is being offered. And most of the trainings in terms of the training numbers are concentrated, as I said, in the North and in South Africa. But there is an increasing appreciation and a growth in where Africans are training. But this educational immigration, so if you do not have training in your country, you need to go to another country. What is the effect on retention through the program and subsequent return to their home countries? And has COVID changed the balance? I know that anecdotally, there are very many trainees who are not able to start their training programs because of the travel restrictions that didn't allow them to go to where the WFNS training centers are, for example, and the financial challenges and the long-term effects of the same. And whereas the survey identified gaps in our knowledge and training experience, there's much that needs to be done. This was my first survey on the continent. I'd just come back from training in the UK. And since then, through AFAN, which is the African Association of those who are interested in neurosurgery, as well as through Young Cans, spearheaded by Ignatius Essene, there's been a much greater emphasis on us doing research and doing good quality research. So I feel that this was answering some questions, but I look forward to my colleagues even bettering on the work that I've done and doing much greater things. And we need a database of trainees. This will help in workforce capture and making our research much more robust. I was talking about the financial side, so I won't belabor that. And we need to look at how the training is delivered, whether it needs to be time-based or competency-based, and who will fund for that prolonged training. I thank each and every one of the authors who taught me a lot. They're all from different African countries, and they gave a different flavor to how this work was conducted, many of whom had been around long enough to have done previous studies on the continent and were able to spearhead and in fact sometimes get us new contacts for getting the work done. So now over to the audience. Having described what I've done, the challenges that I've had, and perhaps having looked at the paper, the areas that you could think that perhaps we could look into improvement, I look forward to hearing from you about where next we should be heading. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chester. You can unshare your screen.
I'm trying to exit the, has it gone off?
Yeah.
If you just unshare me, that'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation and sharing your experience to us. Earlier today, we actually put up a link to check where are you guys, our audience actually joining from. So we can see that we have audience coming all the way from North of America, which is in the morning, and Asia right now here with me. It's at night, 11 p.m. this point in time, and also in Africa and South Africa. We also know that some audience actually put up in the chat that they are unable to ping the location. We'll try to add them in our slides later. So I would like to open the discussion to our audience. If you are able to, please raise up your hand if you have any questions or anything that you would like to ask our two amazing speakers here today. Anything from anyone? If not, then I shall start first. So I have a question to Dr. Batikulon. I think I share you sharing us your experience on surveys, and I actually read both the papers, and understanding what Dr. Chasram was saying, the difficulty in Africa. If comparing two different studies, how you approach if we would like to do a survey on a bigger continent, for example, if like right now the first survey on just Southeast Asia, but do it more than 5 countries, like 10 or 15 countries.
Thank you, Rajit. I think really the strength of our study is that this is a study in 5 countries, and you have 5 authors who are in these countries. It would have been, for example, it would have been more difficult, for example, if it were just me doing a survey on trainees in all these 5 countries. So I think really if you want to capture more data from more places, I would really recommend getting a collaborator who knows what it's like to be there. So I've said sometimes, my guiding principle now is if I'm thinking of starting a research project, especially something that aims to describe the situation or that aims to give a picture, if you really want a complete picture of what it's like in that area, you would really need someone there. You would really need someone there. Remember, always ask yourself, is this my story to tell? That is the most important thing. Before you start on a project, ask yourself, is this my story to tell? Or am I actually telling the story that somebody else should tell? So in the same way that Bev said that, you see, the problem is most African literature is written by people who are not Africans. So I think that's what we're trying to make people more conscious about now. So it's not just about trying to get that paper out. It's actually most important now to remember whenever we do global health, global surgery research, your aim is not to be the voice. Your aim is to amplify the voices, right? Because the people who live in these countries, they have a voice. It's just that they're not heard enough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Batikulon. Anyone has any question? If not, then I'll ask another question to Dr. Chasram. Dr. Chasram, knowing what you know now and the experience that you get from that paper, how, if you were to do the same studies or something similar, what would your strategy be, recruitment strategy be?
I think that the first thing I would say is I wish I had Ronnie as my mentor when we were starting this out, because I had a pressing question when we started, but not as much understanding about the great variability on the continent. So the first thing you said about, is this my story to tell? I think that we did have authors from all the countries, but particularly when it came to trainees, maybe we needed to collaborate maybe with AFAN that has more trainees on it, and Young Cans, and have more of them on the group, so that when we're writing, they can pursue the narrative that is most appropriate to them. Then maybe using a mixed method. So you do want the data that gives you the numbers, but you want to capture the experiences in other formats, whether it's a focus group, and now we can do focus groups even on Zoom, or whether we can do one-to-one surveys, in-depth surveys. I think if I look back at it, one of the things that I did have is inexperience on my side. I hadn't really thought broadly. And because COVID gave us a pressure of time, you really want to say a lot of things at the same time. And you want to be the first one to say, as I said, I was really mindful that the African literature was written by African authors. That pressure of time perhaps took away from diversifying the content. That's the first thing. The second thing is we did a one-off in 2020. And one of the challenges is we're using bodies that are not fundamentally research bodies or educational bodies. So now that I've been on the continent long enough, perhaps we should have worked through the West African Association for Training and looked at the Mediterranean, the North African trainee group, COSEXA in East Central Southern Africa. Perhaps those are the groups that are much more invested in the challenges for trainees and would have been better collaborative partners, and they would have helped us get the program directors and the senior registrars on, and maybe the information would have been very different. That's one. And that would also have allowed us to do interval assessments. So if we'd started out with a long-term vision and said maybe every 6 months we'll check up on you and see where we're at, and then we'd capture things like adaptability. We'd look at retention rates. We'd look at what people are struggling with, and and all that would have been very rich data that now we can't really capture because we didn't think long-term when we started.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. So I realized reading both papers, like what Dr. Batikina was telling, his paper was like focused on 5 countries, and each author was like from each country. I was trying to figure out like what's the best mechanism would I do if I were to repeat the same thing if I want to do for the African continent, for example. So thank you so much for sharing your insight. Is there any question from the audience? Anyone want to ask or share something?
Razi, I can jump in with a question. Dr. Chisholm, it was something that was generated from the results of your paper, but I suspect that both of you might have a response. One of the things that you commented on was, I think in your words, it was the proliferation of webinars and online courses and all these opportunities that are created now that we've gone virtual, but then also the challenges of that. Given that we're 2 years in, have you seen or thought about coordination of these, and how do we streamline those opportunities so that they're coordinated? I think that's particularly relevant for our group as we introduced a new webinar during this time. And I'm just curious how the different groups that you engage with are using online platforms to supplement some of the challenges that you've had with the training gaps during the pandemic. And I suspect that both of you have some insight to that that we can learn from.
That's a very, very good question. I think that the webinars have given us an incredible opportunity, but also a challenge in terms of what do we do with this power and opportunity that we have. So let me just start from the beginning. One of the best things that it did when COVID happened is most neurosurgeons or many surgeons are workaholics. So we were missing work and our colleagues and what we normally do. And there was a certain sense of, shall we say, psychological and intellectual comfort in being able to connect with our colleagues around the world. And that was very, very good. The second thing is that it opened up spaces that didn't exist before. So for example, if I take the example on the African continent, AFAN and the young African neurosurgeons started their webinar series. And it was and was a fantastic opportunity to connect with each other across the continent. It gave voices. I mean, we met a lot of people who were doing things we never really knew that they were doing. And so it really opened up that space. In terms of the high income and low income countries, many of the talks that were being presented by people who are experts in their field had previously not been available so openly, especially because anybody could go into the Q&A and ask a question to any of these masters. So that was an incredible democratization of that space. Now the challenge that we've got is everything needs a plan. So the fact that, putting my educational hat on, we don't just need more talks. We need talks that answer particular questions, So are we answering questions on just core knowledge, or are we answering of how do I do it? Are we answering about research or collaboration? We just need a little bit more refinement so that, I know all of us have had that experience. You can attend 6, 7 webinars, and after a while realize you've had that talk before, So we just need to curate that content a little bit more intelligently. For low-income countries, this is a fantastic opportunity for us to collaborate on teaching, because we don't have the massive libraries, and we don't necessarily have all the experts in our field. If I take the example of Kenya, we don't have functional neurosurgery, but we still have epilepsy cases and dystonias, etc. So this would be an opportunity maybe for our trainees to get together and get a formal teaching plan about how we're going to learn about managing patients with functional problems, with the intention of in the next couple of years developing local or regional services for the same. So those are the kind of conversations we need to be having. How do we use this tool most effectively for not only education of residents, but upskilling people who are already in practice but want to learn what's out there, and do it in a way that allows all of us to learn and give everyone an opportunity to discuss. So a lot of the times it's the low-income countries are just listening rather than saying, this is how I solve my problem for hydrocephalus, and this is what I do for trauma, and these are my outcomes. We just need to democratize that space a bit more. I don't know, Ronnie, what you'd say.
You gave such a perfect response after Chester. I don't have anything further to add.
You're such a charmer.
Seriously. I suppose, the good thing, I really like what you said about it needs to be democratized. I think it would be interesting maybe if somebody looks at the profiles of speakers in the webinars that proliferated during COVID-19 and just have a look who dominated the conversation. As I've said, you have to understand, sometimes for example, you might think, for example, as a speaker, I'm always conscious of when I talk about this, will this actually be applicable to my audience? Again, that has to do with how you present your work or who you think your intended audience is. You see, we all have our biases, and we just need to be conscious of that. We need to be aware of our biases, our limitations in our perspective. And I suppose I would like to add that, the other thing I wanted to let the group know that, since our paper has come out, the 5 of us now, together with a handful of other pediatric neurosurgeons, we now meet regularly every month. And what we do is we select pediatric neurosurgical topics, and we just discuss. I mean, it's an informal talk. So I think I think is actually quite helpful for us, because because it's less formal than an organized webinar, and it's just like getting to see your friends every month for an hour to talk about the cases that you do, how you do things.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight. Yeah, one thing that even I, as a junior resident, noticed that even though COVID sort of like restrict our movement, but it opened up the other channel where right now everyone across the world can be together and sort of join in for any webinars and talks. Previously, if you want to join a conference, you might have to fly to another country, and that might cost a lot of money for people from lower and middle income countries. But right now, you are able to join anything online with just a click anywhere you are. So that is definitely a tremendous opportunity for us young residents and neurosurgeons. I have a question in the chat from Ralph that asks, with regards to collaboration, how do you develop collaborative networks of researchers for future multi-country research work, especially for young researchers who haven't developed that network yet? I'll open the question to both of the speakers.
Get a Twitter account. No, seriously, I think, how I started with global neurosurgery research? So when I was in Uganda, it was 2016, I was there for 6 weeks. I was there at the same time as Dr. Michael Duan, who's now in Vanderbilt, back in Vanderbilt as their consultant pediatric neurosurgeon. And that was the time when he was doing the global neurosurgery papers with Dr. Key Park. And it just so happened, I had never before published a paper. I didn't get to publish a paper until I was a consultant, to be honest. So I've only been publishing in the last 4 years. As I've said, it really depends on what you want to get out of it. So, for example, I believe, for example, that if there are two types of trainees, those who like research and those who don't like research. And I think that you shouldn't force them to do research if they don't want to do research. Otherwise, you just end up with a pile of research papers just for the sake of completion or graduation, and that's a waste of resources and time. So I think so. How do you learn all these things? How do you get to do these collaborative work? So try to collaborate. I mean, try to reach out. Don't hesitate to reach out. So if you see something interesting on Twitter, send a message or comment or ask questions. Or if you find an interesting paper, look at the email of the corresponding author and send an email. You know, it's all those small things. And when you do have conferences, it's really important. It's really important. For example, when you go to in-person conferences, to try to talk, to try to actually engage in conversation. But as I've said, it might be difficult, especially being from an LMIC. As I've said, there's that mentality, there's that thinking, oh, I am not good enough to be in that conversation, or my point of view is pointless. My point of view is not important. As I've said, I would really encourage our Global North colleagues to please engage the young ones, especially those who are interested in doing this, because it's I think it's the way we move forward.
Thanks, Ronnie. That's a really good answer. And actually, I like the way you were very candid, because for a long time I thought you've been in the business for ages. So I was feeling like I was the one with the imposter syndrome, and in some ways I am. I mean, I wrote this paper when I was a fellow, and I didn't have much experience in global health. I knew a few people in the periphery, and they were fortunate enough to give me an opportunity to do this. So I think, first of all, there are more opportunities now than there have ever been. I think there are certain groups that are opening up the space. So if I look at AFAN, which is now coming up with research fellowships, and I think there's a multiplier effect here. I mean, Ulrich is a particularly dynamic guy, but he's also a beneficiary of the Harvard training that he received within this program. And you're having a multiplier effect from somebody like that, who's connecting people, opening up skills and telling them, it's okay, you don't have to do the whole paper. Let's break it down and do it together. And what you find when you do something like that is you learn from everybody else. So AFAN is one, and now many of the intercontinental bodies have young neurosurgical bodies, and they have research arms. And then, as Ronnie would probably say, the Young Neurosurgical Forum is going to be looking for opportunities for more collaborative research for young neurosurgeons who are either in residency or within 10 years of their practice. I think that if I look within the African context, and actually when I say African context, I mean in all of us have a particular way in which we phrase stories. And one of the challenges when you get into the scientific space is you feel like, I have a story to tell. I just don't know the norms that are so accepted within this social space. And that's one of the biggest challenges if you're in an LMIC. Many of the communities of neurosurgeons or surgeons, they're small, they're doing more clinical work rather than basic science, but they have a lot for us to learn from their experience. So what we need, and some of the journals are doing this, and some of the research groups are doing this, is they're offering more mentorship about how to write. Then I suppose, because Prof. Park is here and I can see a few of the names, is the model that we're using at the moment always going to be sustainable? We are the Twitter generation, we are the Instagram generation. We're used to bite-sized information that has a lot of infographics. So we need perhaps to capture that way of scientific communication a bit more and give credit to those who are that minded, because that's how we communicate to each other now. You know, we watch short clips of things rather than read long papers. So maybe we need to look at different ways of talking to each other.
Thank you so much for sharing. I can relate from the answers, like feeling like imposter syndrome, and how coming from LMICs really make it difficult for you to actually get involved even in global surgery. I was lucky I met Dr. Kipak in 2017 in Istanbul when he was talking about global neurosurgery, and that's how I actually get involved. Anyone has any other question for our panelists? We have 5 more minutes. Anything?
I might say a few words. Razi making a great job organizing this research seminar. I mean, first it was framed as really methodology and surveys, but it's really developed into an incredible discussion about equity in research and representation, right? And who should be telling the story. And these are great topics to discuss. I learned something today. Ronnie, by the way you put all your co-authors together to discuss the paper with the video of each one of those shots, that was amazing. We should be doing that. That should be the standard when we present papers, not just have one person talk about it, but engage every member of the authorship team. So thank you for showing us how to do that. I really do think there's a cultural shift that's happening right now. We have Ronnie and Beverly talking today at the PGSSC about research by and from LMICs, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And then Ignatius Asena, some of you heard his name today, and both Ronnie and Beverly mentioned him. He's the assistant editor for the Journal of Global Neurosurgery, but he gave the grand rounds at Mass General today on research. He's a Cameroonian neurosurgeon giving a talk at probably the Ivory Tower Institution in neurosurgery about research methodology. So, there is a shift happening for sure, and we need to just sustain that effort so that, what was normal before should no longer be acceptable, right? And then what we're talking about today should become the norm. So well done, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Pa. Thank you, Dr. Pa. We have a few more minutes. Anyone has anything else they want to add or ask the question to our panelists? Yes.
This is David participant from Orlando, Florida, pediatric neurosurgery. Excellent presentations. Beverly, thank you so much for educating people like me. Ronnie, you hit it out of the park. Quick question, a comment and a question. Beverly, your comment about the new generation using Twitter handles and short bites to get the message across. Ronnie, I liked your slide where you showed the power of Twitter rather than publications almost. Friends, can you teach people, because the old setup is still journals, acceptance, and publications, rejections. As the former editor of Pediatric Neurosurgery Journal, I know that problem very well. Please tell us, how do you propose we change to the new, younger, dynamic model that gives LMICs a much better playing surface? Thank you.
Ronnie, I'll let you go first.
I was going to let you go first, but I think, Yogi, when you're an LMIC researcher, it's all stacked against you. You're a peer reviewer, the editor. I wouldn't want to go into specifics, but I've had peer reviews where clearly I was seeing the white gaze. This was white gaze being, and I think if we're really serious about leveling the field, the news just came out about TNF, Taylor and Francis charging express fees for peer reviews. So it really goes against everything we're trying to work for. But it has to be top down. I mean, you have to look at who are your peer reviewers, who are your editors. Is there a way for LMICs to be able to afford to getting published? And that's it has to be an active effort. It has to be active efforts. For example, if it means making sure that every peer reviewer goes through this, and make sure that you run through these are our principles. I think that's the only way to go.
Thank you, Yogi. I think, first of all, it's a very loaded question. I think, first of all, there's a lot of literature already in African and LMIC countries that is just not accessible in the traditional sense. So if you think about everyone who's in medical school writes some form of project, or those who do their MA programs have to write a thesis, but the probability that somebody will access this work and quote it is very low. So the person's gone through all the trouble of collecting the data, publishing and presenting it within their local setup, but they don't have a way to bridge that gap and make their work readily available so that somebody somewhere else, when they're asking what is the incidence, for example, of vestibular schwannomas or myelomeningocele in Tanzania, that you read the work done by the local surgeon. So we need to ask ourselves, is the journals and PubMed indexing the only way to give credit to the author, or do we need to open up that space? Recently, we were applying for a grant, and the grant was it was a grant that was collaborative with that high-income country. And they just asked, which are your PubMed index papers? So it didn't matter if I'd presented in a local meeting. It didn't matter if I presented done my work in a local journal. It didn't matter if it was an MEd work that had been checked out and approved by the institution that I was. That didn't count. And all the challenges of accessing PubMed index journals in terms of fees, in terms of the review process, because they're more likely to set the agenda. And when they set the agenda, your content may not be at the top of the list in their priorities. But this democratization is possible. If we think about Wikipedia, Wikipedia was unimaginable 20 years ago, but many of us now rely on Wikipedia for certain bits of information and the fact that we collaboratively update it. We look on Google searches. So the question, and we know we do have Google Scholar, but we still don't give as much credit to work that is publicly available in quite the same way as the credit that we give to PubMed indexed work. Some conferences, for example, if I look at the EANS, what they do is all the presentations that you do within EANS conferences is given a link. I think there's a particular number that allows you to update your work on ORCID or any of the other ways of showing score. So maybe we need to look at platforms like that so that if something is done in an East African conference, that work can be uploaded and then you can read about it. If something is done in Philippines, I want to read about it from the resident who sees all the patients in casualty, not from somebody who's visited for a few weeks. Yeah. So those are the kind of things going through my mind. I don't know what you think, Yogi.
Both excellent points. I know time is up and Key dropped off. I feel bad. Yes, it's nice to have Cameroon neurosurgeon give a grand rounds at Harvard, but the future, friends, is Ronnie and Key and all the rest of you. Why don't you consider the future where you get funding from Twitter, Facebook, etc., to have journals that have nothing with the current PubMed publications? As I'm giving a lecture tomorrow to the medical students, I'm afraid that they're going to be in the back of the room Googling the latest and greatest information, not the latest published journal, mind you. And that's where they get the information. And like you said, Wikipedia and etc. are great sources, which are mostly reliable. And maybe you'll generate a new journal format that is totally different from the current ivory tower mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are 2 minutes over time. Thank you so much for everyone for coming here today. Thank you for our two amazing speakers that actually have amazing discussion and lead the presentation here today. If you guys can take, if our audience can take 1 minute of your time to fill up the surveys and share your opinion on how we can improve these seminars, that would be really helpful. I think there's a few things, even for me as a junior resident, can take away from here. Like one would be, whose story are we telling? I think that's a really first time hit my head on when we're doing papers. And second is, let's break the barriers. Let's make sure that there's an equal playing field for everyone. We as the next generation of residents and neurosurgeons ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to share their story. Thank you so much for coming here today. Hope to see you guys again next month. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Thank you.